Alright, me. It is July something. I think it's like the 12th. Um, and today I spent part of my day reading uh, The Tin Woodman of Oz, which means I'm almost done. I think I have 2 more books. But this is just one of where I've been putting this off for forever. Um, uh, yeah, yeah. Um, the Tin Woodman of Oz, I think, has been the most enjoyable out of them in a long time. Um, and I think part of that is just because it has been a while since I've read one of these, and so it was still a drag. Don't get me wrong there, but it didn't feel as much of a drag, partially because of that, because it was a little bit more time between, right? So that's that. Um, I think part of the reason it also didn't feel like a drag was because the the my issue has been pretty consistently with these books has been the the feeling for L. Frank Baum, for whatever reason, to constantly introduce characters and like continuously expand these characters, right, of like how many we have, right, instead of continuously exploring the characters that are already here, right. um, and so for this one we finally get some sort of thing that's actually about one of the characters and one of the, quote unquote main characters or core characters from the original in Nick Chopper, the Tin Woodman. And this whole exploration of something that like gets offhandedly mentioned, and it's like, oh, we're finally gonna explore this, which is the whole Nick Chopper's entire story is that he fell in love with a munchkin, and then who was a slave, which is another one of these things of, as I've mentioned before, of like Alfred Baum loves to just make everyone a slave, and love slavery, which is a very strange thing. Um, but yeah, especially writing 50 years after the Civil War. So that's that. But like Nick Chopper's story is that he falls in love with his munchkin, and then his axe gets enchanted by a witch, by the witch that is the owner of the munchkin, and then the slowly chops his own body apart effectively, but gets repaired by this tinsmith because no one who's born in the land of Oz can die in the land of Oz. And so he just gets his body replaced by pieces of tin until he's completely tin. And then everything else happens, right? And then we finally get this actual story of like, oh, the Tin Woodman has this heart. And it's like, oh yeah, I set up this entire process, this entire story, my entire story is based around the fact that I needed to go find a heart so that I could love again and finally marry this person. I should go do that now. And like that's like a legitimately a good pitch for a story, right? Is okay, we're going to finally explore what this character actually is. What also made this a bit more enjoyable was the probably about half, I would say half the book, but a good chunk of the book, probably about a third of it, is effectively a retelling of the Circe story, of the living in an isolated land that draws people in, then transforming those into animals or into things for Circe's own pleasure. In this case, it's a yuhuku, I think is what they are. But yeah, right. And so like that, telling that story is more interesting to me than the typical shenanigans of the Wizard of Oz or and the Oz books, which is like, and they get into a little bit here of like the, oh, here's like a chapter about this kind of strange part of the world, and then we never see it again. Right? There's a chapter here that is effectively 2 pages long, really about a page and a half. That is one of our characters named Woot, who's just a wandering soul, gets magically transported into the land of dragons, and then is out of the land of dragons by the end of that page. And it doesn't, there's no reason for that to exist, right? And so I think spending a longer time with the retelling of what is already an established story and retelling it within the rules and the guise of this specific culture, this specific land, these specific rules is a lot more interesting to me, right? So yeah, so that's that. We do get, we end up with this kind of weird thing that's going on here, right? Of what has occurred is that the Tin Woman in Nick Chopper had rusted and was wasting away for who knows how long, because people don't die here. And in that time, a second person has basically done the exact same thing, in which fell in love with Nimi Amy, I think is the name. And then the witch enchanted a sword this time, and so now we get a tin soldier instead of a tin woodman. And the same story plays out, of where he's about to get married, and then as they're about to get married, he gets rusted out, right? So suddenly we meet another tin soldier, another tin person, only to then find out that the person who had made all the tin stuff found this magic glue, and basically combined the two bodies of the tin soldier and the tin woodman into one amalgamated body, one Frankenstein body. And it turns out that body and that person, named Chop Fight, I think it is it actually ends up going to marry this Munchkin girl, that named Nimi Amy, that both tin people were in love with. And it's like, in of itself, that is kind of an interesting thing, right? And I think that once again we go into this whole thing of L. Frank Baum's supposedly entire guise of all of this and writing these stories was that there was no romance in these stories, and yet here we are again, right? Other than that, right, it's also, I think, a very interesting kind of take on relationships and love and who we marry, in which what we end up with is sort of this kind of amalgamation in life of the whole point of dating, the whole point of seeing people, the whole point of doing all these things is so that we understand and we come to an idea of what are things that we can, that we must have in a person, what are things that we feel that we can negotiate or are not deal breakers about people, right? Which to me is a very interesting commentary on, like, these are the two people that this person loved beforehand and was going to marry, and instead we get this kind of third person who is this combination of these first two, that she chooses to love, right? And that she chose to love after she had been freed from slavery because of the death of the witch, right? Which is a very interesting whole concept to me. So that's that. That's that. I think the only other interesting thing here is the way that we start this is that the Tin Woodman, the whole point of the original Wizard of Oz is that he needs to get this heart because he needs to then be able to go get this heart so that he can love Nimmy Amy. And what ends up happening, at least according to the description by Nick Chop and Tin Woodman, is that the heart he was given is what was an incorrect one or faulty one, because it wasn't a heart of love, it was a heart of kindness. And because of that, he never, during his time having a heart up to this point, thought about going and seeing Nimmy Amy, because his heart was made of kindness, not of love, right? Which, and then, you know, we get into this whole thing about love versus kindness and husband responsibilities and things, which I think is an actual interesting and legitimate conversation about this whole thing between love and kindness, and like the right, it's the I think he says at one point, but it's like that if he were to marry Nimmy Amy, he would be the first husband to not love his wife, but also he could guarantee he could be kind to her, which is not something that all husbands can guarantee. Which is a very interesting thing, right? Of like, you can certainly love people, but you certainly don't, you're not kind to them, right? And that, which goes into this whole other conversation about who L. Frank Baum is. And I think I mentioned it before, of like, L. Frank Baum, congratulate him on being someone who was very interested in women's rights and women's suffrage. Do not congratulate him because he was also very much against the indigenous populations of America, and was wanting to completely be rid of those populations. So yeah, right. So this is like, this is one of those things of like, this definitely seems to be L. Frank Baum writing some sort of moral, which is also what he supposedly was super against in children's stories, that like there's this importance to kindness in love and relationships, and that to be someone who is kind and be with someone who is kind is sometimes a bit is better than to be with someone or to choose to be with someone simply because you love them, right? Which is a very interesting thing. So that's that is the Tin Woodman. It's, I think, 2 more books and then it's done, and then I never have to pick up this massive thing again.